I've been doing this series. I finished a series 2 weeks ago called The Theory of Everything, in which we talked about 4 pivotal questions that you need to ask yourself if you're considering a life of faith or if you are desiring to enrich or deepen your life of faith. And all those are on podcasts. If you didn't hear any of them, or need to go back and pick one up. But they're really, we had a lot of fun with that sermon. These are the questions that kind of around which you can construct with intentionality a deeper life of faith. This sermon series that I'm starting today, Making Room for God, is really a follow-up to that. Assuming that you've decided to begin a life of faith or to deepen or enrich your life of faith, how do you make more room for God? I mean, obviously, a life of faith assumes a relationship with a higher being, a transcendent God. So how do you make room for God in order to further deepen that relationship? And so today we're talking about hospitality. Let me invite you to turn to Hebrews, the 13th chapter. Tune in because this one doesn't last long. The first 2 verses. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some have entertained angels without knowing it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There is a wonderful story in Genesis, the 18th chapter, about Abraham and Sarah. I'm always encouraging you about Genesis. You can always read the first book of the Bible. If you'll do that, if you'll just read through half of the first book of the Bible, you will have read so many of the wonderful stories that really are foundational in terms of our Old Testament understanding of the faith. So read through Abraham and Sarah. It takes you through a little bit past the 18th chapter. In this story, Abraham is standing at his tent. They're out there in the desert, in the middle of the desert. Sarah is in her tent, and Abraham is standing at the tent, and all of a sudden he looks up, and he sees 3 strangers, just maybe 100 yards or so from him. And following the rule of the desert, he offers hospitality to them. You always did that in the desert. You could not survive in the desert if there weren't others willing to share water and food with you. And so he sees these 3 men, and he goes out there, and immediately he says, "Let me invite you into my camp. We'll get water for you. We'll feed you." And they say, okay. And they come into Abraham's camp. Immediately he goes into the tent and he asks Sarah, "Please cook some bread, bake some bread." And then he goes and finds the hired hand. In a line that's reminiscent of the rich young ruler, and not the rich young ruler, the prodigal son. He tells the hired hand, he says, "Go get the fatted calf and butcher it because we've got guests and we're going to treat them well." At one point during this time, one of the strangers asked Abraham, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And Abraham says, "Well, she's inside the tent." And the stranger says, "I'm going to come back in a few months, and when I do, even though you and Sarah are well into your old age, I'm going to bless you with a child. Sarah will have a child." And this is such an interesting story because inside the tent, he hears Sarah laugh about the notion of having a child at her age. And soon it becomes clear that this stranger is either God or an angel of God. He says, "Did Sarah laugh?" She's embarrassed. Before long, the 3 men disappear. But Abraham and Sarah realized that these 3 strangers that came into their midst were in fact the angels of God. And so when the writer of the letter to the Hebrews, it is after all the letter to the Hebrews, wrote this, he understood that every good Hebrew would know the reference that he's making in the 2nd verse of this 13th chapter of Hebrews. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in so doing some have entertained angels. Everyone who in that time, 2,000 years ago, who would have read that verse would have known that this was a reference to the story of Abraham and Sarah in the 18th chapter of Genesis. They opened their tent, their camp, and in came the angels of God. So we want to talk a little bit about hospitality this morning. One of the things that I want to say to you is that hospitality is important. if you're in the entertainment business, if you're in the hotel business, if you're in the hospital business. Hospitality is a big thing these days. You want to welcome people. A lot of times people refer to it as radical hospitality. We're going to redo our hospitality program here at Christ Church during the next year. It's going to be a big thing. We want a lot of you to participate. But I'll be clear about this. Hospitality in that sense is a way of welcoming the stranger into your midst. It's what you do for the person who comes through your front door. In fact, we want people to feel welcomed the minute they step onto our campus, out in the parking lot. And that's an important understanding of hospitality. It's what we do as churches, as businesses, as hotels. But the Bible's understanding of hospitality is somewhat different. This is what Genesis tells us, and this is what the writer of the letter to the Hebrews tells us, that when you offer hospitality to another human being, it's not just what you're doing for that other person, but it is a way of inviting God into your life. It's one of the ways in which you invite God. You make room for God in your life when you offer hospitality to another person. So I want to emphasize this again. I never like the thought that some of you might go to lunch after church and you're sitting there at lunch and somebody says, now, what was it the preacher was trying to say to us this morning? So just to make sure that doesn't happen, let me say it again. According to the Bible, hospitality is one of the ways in which we invite God into our lives. And sometimes, by so doing, our lives are changed forever. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in so doing, some have entertained the angels of God. This seems so simple to me. This seems so utterly simple to me. If we want to deepen or enrich the life of faith, all we have to do is to invite other people into our lives. Because when we do so, we're inviting God into our lives. We're opening our lives for the potential of being transformed in radical and important ways. And so why don't we do more of it? Why isn't hospitality right at the tip of our mind throughout the day, the importance of inviting another person into our lives? I think it's because we are so busy and we are so involved in our own lives, we just fail to see those opportunities. Last week, the Memorial Day weekend, I had big plans for the Memorial Day weekend. We were going to invite my grandsons, Liam and Benjamin, to come spend the weekend with us. We allowed their parents to come with them. And we're going to cook out. We're going to cook hot dogs and hamburgers. We were going to swim, do a lot of great, out stuff, fun stuff, the kind of thing you're supposed to do on Memorial Day weekend, right? And of course, it rained and rained and rained all weekend. By the time Monday got here, I could tell that my two grandsons had cabin fever. They'd been stuck inside the house. They were getting a little bit antsy. And so I had a great idea. I gave some money to my son Josh and my daughter-in-law, and I said, take the boys up here. There's a place not far from here, and play laser tag with them. Let them play laser tag. Off they went. How many of you have ever played laser tag? Well, it's a lot of fun. I'd played laser tag with Liam. He's 8 years old, about this tall. We'd played laser tag quite a bit. I wasn't sure about Ben. I thought they're going to turn Ben down. He'd never played laser tag. Ben's only 4 years old, and he's about this tall. And if you've ever played laser tag, you know that the first thing they do is they put this big heavy vest on you. And it's got electronics on the front, electronics on the back, and there's this laser gun there. And I thought there's no way they'll let Ben play laser tag. He's not big enough to carry that vest and carry the gun. But they'll have to find something to do with him. When they got back, it turned out they had this great story. They had all played laser tag. They'd let Ben in to play laser tag, and they'd had great, great fun. But my daughter-in-law was telling me that at one point, Ben, who really got into it, was running back and forth shooting people. He was running down this little hallway, and his feet got mixed up, and he fell. And he was just sprawled out on the floor like this. And the gentleman who was nearby came up to try to help him up, and Ben was down there. That's my Ben. I think I'm going to remember that story for a long time because it seems to me, not only is it a funny story, but it's just so emblematic of the lives we live. We get so caught up in the games we play. The competition, the striving, nothing wrong with it really at all until it just becomes so distracting to us that we don't even notice the person near us who is trying to reach out and make a human connection. It's true, isn't it? We get so caught up in the games we play, hospitality just gets shoved aside. I think I've made reference here lately to David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, has written a new book called The Road to Character. And he's got a chapter in that book called The Big Me. And he talks about the fact that we are now in the era of the big me. And he says we've been there for a number of decades. He says it didn't start in the 80s or the 70s. It started way back in the 50s and 60s. And he tells a story in which he illustrates that transition from the period right after World War II when people came back and they were humble and self-effacing to the time when we became the era of the big me. It's about a football game that took place in January of 1969. Two brilliant, talented quarterbacks faced off with one another. They'd both grown up in the same place, in the rough coal mining fields of western Pennsylvania. One was 10 years older than the other, half a generation older. Those of you who are football fans, if you're as old as I, you already know the game I'm talking about, don't you? Super Bowl III. Johnny Unitas, the Baltimore Colts, Joe Namath, the New York Jets. I once saw Johnny Unitas play a preseason game against the Dallas Cowboys when I was a kid. It was in the Cotton Bowl. It was just a preseason game. It didn't count, but we were so excited. The Cowboys just played great, and they were beating the Colts all the way until the very end. And in the last 10 seconds, Johnny Unitas threw a touchdown pass to Lenny Moore and won the game. I walked away. I knew I had just seen the greatest quarterback in history. What a brilliant athlete he was. So here we are. We've got Johnny Unitas and Joe Namath. They grew up in the same area of western Pennsylvania. But Unitas wore big, high-top black shoes. On the bus, he wore a white short-sleeved shirt with a little black tie. He and the teammates played bridge on the bus with one another. Sports writers hated interviewing Johnny Unitas because he tried to be as dull and unassuming as possible. And all of a sudden, here comes Joe Namath. Joe Namath wore big fur coats. He did advertisements for women's pantyhose. He was a great interview because he would always say something outrageous. He once wrote a book entitled this, "I can't wait for tomorrow to get here because I get better looking every day." And Brooks says, that transition, we're now in the era of the big me. I don't know about you. I'd always like to assume that I'm a Johnny Unitas, competent, good at what I do, but a team player. The team's more important than me. But the truth of the matter is that we're all a part of the era of the big me. Facebook and Twitter and blogs and selfies. And I got to thinking about this. As long as there's so much of me in my life, there's not much room for God. There's just not much room for God. And so maybe part of our challenge as Christians, if we want to deepen the life of faith, is to just become more intentional and focused and disciplined on getting less of me and more of God. And the Bible says one of the ways that you do that is by inviting another human being into your life. That was really the end of my sermon until I started thinking about this morning. I actually went back and I read the 18th chapter again this morning. And when I finished this time, early in the morning, I was actually in my truck out at the park. And when I finished reading it, I was almost a little bit resentful. Because this time as I read it, I thought, here was Abraham standing in his tent with evidently nothing to do. It was like he's out camping. And I said to God, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. We're asking us to read the 18th chapter of Genesis, and Abraham and Sarah out there, and we're bragging about what a great job they did inviting strangers into their lives. But the honest truth is, they didn't have anything else to do. And my life is very, very full. This is what I heard. The busier you are, the more important it is to show hospitality to strangers. Because that is how you invite God into your life.